And joining us now to discuss more about this, the author of The Great U.S.-China Tech War, Gordon Chang. And folks, by the way, I want to underscore this. You're probably watching a report like this and thinking, okay, this is halfway around the world. It's not really going to affect us here in the United States. But Gordon, you tweeted something that kind of puts this in perspective. A desperate Vladimir Putin has again threatened to use nuclear weapons on Ukraine if Russia obtains what he wants with such words, and many suggest talking to him to reduce tension, then China, Iran, and North Korea will step up their nuke threats, then no one will be safe. So, Gordon, this doesn't sound good. I mean, could we really go that step and have nuclear weapons enter the conversation? I mean, I guess it's in the conversation. Could it happen in reality?
It could happen in reality, Bob. And the reason is we don't know what's in Putin's mind, but we do know that he has mobilized and has actually sortied his ballistic missile submarines and his land-based mobile launchers. He did that on March 1st. We know he's been making these threats to use not just tactical nukes, but also his strategic arsenal. In other words, his intercontinental ballistic missiles. We know that the United States doesn't have a credible way of stopping him from using tactical nukes. I mean, President Biden could, for instance, say, well, we'll use our intercontinental ballistic missiles, but that's not a credible threat to Putin. So, you know, this could escalate out of control. We have seen what happens when there's a failure of deterrence. And so, therefore, everything is on the table.
And also, Gordon, after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a partial military mobilization, China's foreign ministry spokesman said, "We call on the relevant parties to realize a ceasefire through dialogue and consultation and find a solution that accommodates the legitimate security concerns of all parties as soon as possible." That certainly seems to mean that China and Xi do not support what Vladimir Putin is saying he wants to do, using nuclear weapons. Do you see a potential pulling away of Xi and China from Putin as Putin becomes more and more irrational and really kind of aggressive?
Well, it's possible, Katrina, but we also heard expressions of Chinese support for Russia's war aims in Ukraine as little as 2 weeks ago when China's third-ranking leader was talking to the State Duma in Moscow. It was very clear and explicit support for the Ukraine war effort. And also Xi Jinping last week, when he was at the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Uzbekistan, used code words core interests to indicate that China supported Russia's war aims. You know, China believes that it is a legitimate security interest of Russia to absorb Ukraine. So although I'd like to think that China's pulling away from Russia, we have really seen no indication of that other than these words, which can be interpreted one way or another.
So what does Russia want now? What does Putin want? And what's going to keep him from getting it? Because it seemed like originally it was going to be just a matter of weeks or months or days that he took over Ukraine. That didn't happen. Yeah. He's embarrassed at home. He's getting desperate. He's threatening to use nuclear weapons. What stops him?
Right now, nothing stops him from using his tactical nukes because we don't have tactical nukes of the right type that would be a credible deterrent.
And why don't we, by the way,
missiles.
Gordon, why don't we have those?
Because the Trump administration actually authorized the development of them, but the Biden administration has been very much against them. And one other thing is that the U.S. Navy doesn't want to carry tactical nukes on their ships and submarines, which I believe is a great mistake. We have an arms control community that has been very much against the development of new nuclear weapons, which would be of the type that would be a credible deterrent. So right now, the only threat that we have really is to use our strategic arsenal. And that means perhaps the end of humanity.
Which is scary. Yeah. Gordon, just getting back to, wasn't this negotiated with Russia that we would not develop those tactical nuclear weapons that you're talking about that theoretically would have been a response?
Well, we have one arms control agreement, nuclear arms control agreement, New START. And technically, we could develop those weapons, but it would require us to destroy other weapons currently in the inventory. And that destruction of nukes would not be a good idea because China is building its nuclear arsenal very fast. And China is not a party to any arms control agreement with the United States. So we're in a very difficult situation where we have the Russian and the Chinese, which have been coordinating their militaries, now have arsenals which probably exceed ours. And so therefore, we're at a disadvantage.
Gordon, just to kind of, in layman's terms here, I mean, I'm sure there are many people watching, myself thinking here, okay, this sounds really scary. Certainly, many of us never thought we would see anyone using nuclear weapons, certainly not in our lifetimes. So what is the reality of this for Americans, potentially?
Well, if Russia were to use tactical nukes because Putin is desperate, then that would break the taboo. China could therefore, decide it would be in their interest to use tactical nukes on Taiwan. There's all sorts of things that can happen. And, Katrina, we're starting to see a breakdown in international order. So, for instance, a week ago, you had Azerbaijan attack Armenia, and Armenia is a Russian ally, because they thought they could get away with it. That whole controversy had been settled in November 2020, and now it's erupting again. And then you have Turkey threaten to seize Greek islands. This is disorder spreading from Ukraine. And we could be in the early stages of a global conflict. Got to remember, World War II didn't start on September 1st, 1939. It took a long time and started slowly in China and Japan, and then it spread to Europe.
What's the biggest threat to us in the U.S.?
The biggest threat is China. But, China and Russia are forming an axis, and it's not just Moscow and Beijing. It's also North Korea and Tehran are starting to band together, and they're all starting to threaten to use their most destructive weapons. So, this is unthinkable, but nonetheless, it's becoming a reality. Every day we're getting closer to this.
Gordon, to what do you attribute this breakdown?
I think it's the failure of the Biden administration. You had the calamitous withdrawal from Afghanistan. That convinced Vladimir Putin that the United States would not stop Russia from invading Ukraine. So Putin then went forward. Now you have the Chinese being very explicit about it in their propaganda, saying that the Biden administration is incapable, and therefore we will not defend Taiwan. So we don't have to speculate what the Chinese are thinking. It's actually in their propaganda, and they're serious about it. So we're talking about war spreading from Ukraine, both east and west across the Eurasian landmass.
All right. Scary, but we appreciate your sharing your insights and, of course, your expertise, Gordon Chang.
Thanks, Katrina, and thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
No crooked establishment.
None of that twisting the truth.
No talking down to me.
Don't tell me how to think.
Don't tell me how to
Don't
think.
tell me how to think.
I trust Newsmax.
Newsmax.
They don't tell me how to think.
They let
me decide.
Newsmax.
real news
For real people.